The stories you're about to hear begin just as Paddington Bears returned to London from a visit to his old haunts in darkest Peru. He's been there to attend the birthday celebrations of his Aunt Lucy at the home for retired bears in Lima. But now he's back at his London home again with Mr. and Mrs. Brown, their children, Judy and Jonathan, and their housekeeper, Mrs. Bird. And he's got some unexpected money. £10 he won in the ship sweep on the last day of the voyage back. So the first story is called Paddington Buys a Share.
On the first day of his return to number 32 Windsor Gardens, Paddington was extremely busy. Apart from all the unpacking he had to do, there were visits to be paid, stories to be told, not once, but time and time again, cupboards to be investigated, old and familiar chairs to be sat in fact, all the 1,001 things to do with settling down once more into a normal life at his old home. Everyone was so pleased to see him and to hear all about his trip that the hours seemed to melt away, and by the time he went to bed that evening, he felt as if he hadn't been away at all. After weeks of sleeping in a bunk, it was nice to be back in his old bed, especially as during his absence Mr. Brown had redecorated his room so that it now had powder-blue walls and gleaming white, freshly painted woodwork, not to mention a notice board for his day-to-day reminders, and there was a brand-new carpet on the floor. "The old one was getting rather threadbare," explained Mrs. Brown when she brought him his breakfast in bed the following morning. "We bought you a patterned one so that it won't show your stains quite so much." "My stains, Mrs. Brown?" exclaimed Paddington, looking most offended as he sat up in bed rubbing his eyes. "Your stains," repeated Mrs. Bird sternly, letting in a flood of sunshine as she drew the curtains. "The old carpet was so stiff with dried marmalade we practically had to saw it in two to get it out of the room." Mrs. Brown looked nervously at Paddington. "Have you planned anything for this morning?" she asked. Paddington dipped his paw thoughtfully into the jar of marmalade. "Not really, Mrs. Brown," he announced vaguely. "There's some special shopping to do, and I want to put my winnings in the bank for safety." "A very good idea," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't like to think of you carrying all that money around in your suitcase. You never know what may happen." Mrs. Brown looked most relieved at Paddington's reply. Things had been unusually quiet just lately at number 32 Windsor Gardens, and she'd woken that morning with the nasty feeling that the peace of recent weeks was about to be shattered. "I shouldn't go counting your chickens before they are hatched," said Mrs. Bird grimly, when Mrs. Brown gave voice to her thoughts as they were going back downstairs. Although she didn't say anything, the Browns' housekeeper also had the feeling that she was witnessing the quiet before the storm. Nevertheless, try as she might, even Mrs. Bird could find little to grumble at when Paddington appeared at the kitchen door some while later, dressed and ready to greet the morning air. His fur was well brushed, and even his old duffel coat looked unusually respectable as he disappeared out of the house and hurried off down the road in the direction of the Portobello Market, carrying his suitcase in one paw and an important-looking booklet marked Floyd's Bank in the other. Pausing only to call at the baker's in order to renew his standing order for buns and to have a chat about his various experiences while he'd been away, he hurried on towards the antique shop run by his friend Mr. Gruber. Normally, Paddington shared his elevenses with Mr. Gruber, and he wanted to warn his friend that he might be a little late that morning. Paddington was a popular bear with the traders in the market, and his progress down the Portobello Road was much slower than he'd intended, so that, what with one thing and another, by the time he'd reached the bank, it was almost 10 o'clock. However, he was pleased to see that he was first in the queue, and after looking round carefully to make sure that no one was watching, he settled himself down on the pavement, withdrew the bundle of notes from his suitcase, and began counting them once again in order to make sure they were all there. Paddington had had an account with the local branch of Floyd's for some time, but although he occasionally paid them a visit in order to have a chat with the manager and to make sure everything was all right, it wasn't often he'd had the opportunity to put any actual money in, and he was looking forward to the event. The notes were crisp and new and rather difficult to separate with paws, so that in no time at all he became lost to the outside world, and it wasn't until a shadow fell across the pavement that he realized anyone else was about. Hurriedly stuffing the money under his duffel coat, Paddington looked up to meet the gaze of a tall, rather distinguished-looking man in a black overcoat and bowler hat. The man raised his hat politely. "Pardon me, Bear," he said. "I couldn't help noticing what you were doing, and I wondered if we were here on the same mission." Not to be outdone, Paddington jumped to his feet, still clutching the money tightly beneath a fold in his duffel coat, and raised his own hat with a free paw. "I don't think I'm here on a mission," he replied. "I've come to put my money in the bank." "Look after the pennies," said the man approvingly, "and the pounds will look after themselves. That's what I always say." "Oh, they're not pennies," said Paddington. "They're pounds. I won over 10 on a ship sweep." £10? You don't mean to tell me you're putting it all into the bank?" "Not all £10," said Paddington. "I want to save part of it to buy some presents." The man took hold of Paddington's arm and led him a little way along the street. "What a good thing we met," he exclaimed. "It must have been fate." He looked all round, and then lowered his voice confidingly. "Now, if you'd told me you were taking your money out, I'd have understood. Between you and me and the gatepost, all's not well with Floyd's." Paddington's eyes grew larger as he listened. "What? All's not well with Floyd's?" "Shh!" The man put his finger to his lips as he drew Paddington into a nearby doorway. "Not too loud, Bear," he said hastily. "You might start a panic, and then there's no knowing what will happen." He peered out into the street, and then eyed Paddington thoughtfully, as if trying to make up his mind whether he could trust him or not. "You look like a bear of the world," he said at last. "I wonder, can you tell me what we're standing on at this moment?" Paddington looked most surprised at the question. "A paving stone," he answered promptly. "Aha, yeah. But can you tell me what's underneath that?" "Earth?" said Paddington doubtfully. The man gave a chuckle, and then withdrew a small glass bottle of dark liquid from an inside pocket. "I'll let you into a secret, Bear," he said, as he held it up to the light. "Oil. That's what we're standing on. Millions of pounds worth of oil." He pointed towards a dark patch on the road nearby. 99 people out of 100, he continued, would say that had dripped from a car. They don't realize it's seeping up through the ground under their very feet. I tell you, anyone who buys a share in the Portobello Oil Company now is going to make a fortune out of the interest alone." "The Portobello Oil Company?" exclaimed Paddington. "I don't think I've ever heard of that before." The man felt in his pocket again. "Not many people have. It hasn't been going very long." "Look here, Bear," he said, as he held out a piece of paper. "I must say I've taken a liking to you. These shares are really worth £15 each, but I think I could manage to let you have one for 10. Paddington looked at the man doubtfully. "It's very kind of you," he said, "but I don't think I could afford £10. I really wanted to buy some presents as well." "Nonsense," said the man briskly, as he crossed off the word 15 on the piece of paper and wrote in the word 10. "You'll be able to buy all the presents you need with the interest, and more besides." Before Paddington had a chance to even open his mouth, let alone say anything, he found himself clutching the share while the man quickly transferred the bundle of notes from his paw to an inside pocket. "Now, don't forget," he warned, "not a word to anyone. I don't want the news to get around, at least not until the derricks arrive, and then you can tell anyone you like." "The derricks?" repeated Paddington. "The oil-drilling equipment," explained the man. "I have to go and see about them this morning." "When do I collect my interest?" asked Paddington anxiously. The man chuckled. "Yeah, I can see you have an eye to business," he said. "A bear after my own heart. Now, if you care to meet me here tomorrow morning, same time, same place, I'll see what I can do. But remember," he whispered, Keep it under your hat. We don't want the bottom to drop out of the market." With that, he gave a final wave of his rolled umbrella and then hurried off up the Portobello Road, leaving Paddington standing on the pavement, looking at his piece of paper with an excited gleam in his eyes. It was an impressive-looking document, covered with a flowery sort of print which was rather difficult to read. Studying it, he was just able to make out the words Portobello Oil Company across the top, but underneath the print was so small and there was so much of it, he soon decided he would have to take it home and examine it more closely at his leisure. Remembering the man's instructions, he folded the piece of paper carefully into 4 and then placed it under his hat for safety. Paddington had never owned any sort of share before, let alone a £10 one in an oil company, and he felt most important as he made his way back along the road. All the same, he trod very carefully when he crossed over to the other side in the direction of the shops. Apart from telling him to keep the matter under his hat, the man had also said something about not wanting the bottom to drop out of the market, and he wasn't the sort of bear to take any unnecessary chances. When he reached the other side of the road, Paddington hesitated for a moment outside the window of a small store. There was a thoughtful expression on his face as he peered through the glass at the various items on display. Although he'd brought home several small presents for the Browns, he was anxious to buy them something really nice in return for their kindness in paying for his trip to Peru. With the interest on his new share, Paddington felt sure he would be able to buy some very good presents indeed, and he felt equally certain that the owner of the shop would be only too pleased to wait until the next day for his money, for despite his habit of driving a hard bargain, all the shopkeepers and other dealers in the market held Paddington in high regard. With the promise of riches to come, Paddington took rather longer over his shopping that morning than he'd at first intended, and by the time he reached Mr. Gruber's antique shop for Elevenses, his friend was already waiting anxiously outside. "I began to think you weren't coming, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed. "I had to put a saucer over your mug so that the cocoa wouldn't get cold." Paddington sank gratefully into one of the deck chairs on the pavement, while Mr. Gruber bustled around, setting a tray of buns on a nearby table. "I've been buying a few coming-home presents, Mr. Gruber," he explained. Mr. Gruber looked at him reprovingly over the top of his glasses. "It's very thoughtful of you, Mr. Brown," he said, "and I'm sure everyone will be most grateful, but I hope you've left yourself some money to put in the bank for a rainy day. There have been 1 or 2 rather nasty cases of fraud in the market just lately," he continued, before Paddington could reply. "I was very pleased this morning when you told me you were putting your money in a safe place." Mr. Gruber settled himself in a deck chair alongside Paddington and sipped his cocoa. "It seems that someone has been going around selling false shares for a firm called the Portobello Oil Company. You'll find this difficult to believe, Mr. Brown, but 1 or 2 foolish people have actually bought one." Mr. Gruber looked at Paddington with some concern as a loud, choking sound came from behind his cocoa mug. "Oh, I do hope it's not too hot, Mr. Brown," he exclaimed. It's all right, Mr. Gruber," gasped Paddington hastily. I was having trouble with one of my buns. I think a current must have gone down the wrong way." Mr. Gruber gave Paddington a pat on the back and then settled himself once again in order to resume his story. "The man they're after," he said, "is called Jim the Dandy." "Jim the Dandy?" echoed Paddington, looking more and more worried. "That's right," said Mr. Gruber. "They call him that because of the way he dresses, just like someone who works in the city. In fact, you'd have a job to tell him from the real thing. I hope they catch him soon," he continued. "Otherwise he'll begin to give the market a bad name. I was talking to a policeman only yesterday, and he agreed with me that there's only one thing worse than selling something that isn't there to sell, and that is buying something and not paying for it." Mr. Gruber shook his head sadly. "There's been quite a bit of that going on just lately too, Mr. Brown," he added. "But I'm pleased to say the police are hot on the trail of the culprits. I only hope when they do catch up with them, they'll get what they deserve." Mr. Gruber broke off as before his astonished gaze Paddington suddenly jumped out of his chair, removed his overcoat, and hastily bundled it over his pile of shopping. "Are you sure you're feeling all right, Mr. Brown? I must say you don't look too good." Paddington gave a worried glance up and down the market. "I'm all right, thank you very much, Mr. Gruber, but I'm not too sure about things in general." Mr. Gruber knew better than to inquire into matters which might be difficult to explain. All the same, he began to look more and more concerned as Paddington slumped back into his chair, leaving a half-eaten bun untouched on the plate by his side. But if Mr. Gruber looked worried, Paddington himself was even more woe-begone. His face had been long enough to start with, but it lengthened still further some while later as he made his way back towards Windsor Gardens and had time to consider all that had happened that morning. By the time he reached the familiar green front door of number 32, his face had fallen to its longest ever. But by then his hat was pulled down so well over his forehead, and his head had sunk so low into his shoulders that only the closest observer would have noticed anything amiss. Paddington lifted the brim of his hat, gave one last worried glance up and down Windsor Gardens, and then disappeared from view, closing the door behind him with a loud click which seemed to suggest that one member of the Brown family at least wouldn't be receiving any more visitors that day. Mrs. Bird was the first member of the household to notice the change that had suddenly come over Paddington. "I can't understand it," she remarked the following day. "He was so bright and cheerful yesterday morning. Now he looks as if he'd got all the cares of the world on his shoulders." "I do hope it's not the after-effects of all his travelling," said Mrs. Brown. "Whatever it is, it happened when he went out shopping in the market," said Mrs. Bird. "He came back afterwards looking very down in the mouth. He didn't even finish his treacle pudding at lunch-time." "I must admit he has been acting rather strangely," agreed Mrs. Brown. "I caught him drilling a hole in the garden with Henry's brace and bit yesterday afternoon. He seemed most upset about something." "If you ask me," said Mrs. Bird, "it's got something to do with money." "Money?" Mrs. Brown began to look even more anxious. "Whatever makes you say that?" "He spent all yesterday evening doing his accounts," said Mrs. Bird, "and when he'd finished, he wanted to borrow the red ink. Besides," she continued, "there was that business with the paper this morning, and he was asking Mr. Brown a lot of very odd questions at breakfast." Mr. Brown worked in the City of London, and every breakfast time, before going to his office, he studied a special newspaper which was all about stocks and shares. That very morning he discovered that one of the middle pages was missing. No one had owned up to taking it, but at the time Mrs. Bird had had her suspicions as to the culprit, and now she was certain. "That young bear's up to something," she exclaimed. "He had a bath of his own accord last night. That's always a bad sign. And when he went out this morning he was all dressed up. I don't like the look of things at all." Mrs. Bird attacked the corner of the dining room with a feather duster in order to emphasize her words as she looked out of the window. But keen though her eyesight was, it would have had to penetrate not only a good many buildings, but quite a few other objects on the way as well, to have caught even a glimpse of Paddington. For apart from being a good many miles away, the object of her suspicions was also at that moment effectively hidden behind a seething mass of dark suits, bowler hats, briefcases, and rolled umbrellas. In fact, as he emerged from the depths of the underground and found himself being carried along the pavement like a cork in a millstream, Paddington decided he couldn't remember ever having been in such a crowd before. Fortunately, the tide soon divided itself into a number of smaller streams, and after a good deal of struggling, he eventually managed to force his way in the direction he wanted to go, until, at long last, he found himself in a much narrower street, at the end of which stood a tall, important-looking building. After carefully consulting his map in order to make sure he was in the right place, Paddington took a deep breath and pushed open the door. He stood for a moment with wide-open eyes as he took in the scene all around him. Everywhere men were rushing hither and thither, carrying briefcases or pieces of paper as they went about their business. If the pavement outside had been crowded, the inside of the building, by comparison, seemed like a gigantic ant-heap, and Paddington was about to explore further when a heavy hand descended onto his shoulder and held him in a vice-like grip. "Here," said a gruff voice. "What are you a-doing of?" Paddington jumped and turned to see a man in a dark blue uniform and a silk hat staring down at him. "I suppose you know this is the Stock Exchange?" said the man sternly. "Oh, yes," replied Paddington importantly. "That's why I'm here. I've come to exchange one of my stocks." "You what?" The man looked at Paddington suspiciously. "Are you trying to pull my leg bare?" "Oh, no," said Paddington earnestly, as he undid his suitcase and withdrew his share. "I've come all the way from Windsor Gardens especially to do it." "Oh, dear," said the man, his expression softening slightly. "I'm afraid I can't help you, then. Mind you," he added, as he caught sight of the disappointed look on Paddington's face, "if there's anything else I can do, I'll only be too pleased. Us waiters is here to oblige." At the sound of the man's words, Paddington brightened considerably. It had been a long journey all the way from Windsor Gardens in the crowded tube train, and he was feeling hot and thirsty. Mr. Brown had answered a lot of his questions about the Stock Exchange, but he certainly hadn't mentioned anything about there being free refreshments, and it seemed a very good idea indeed. "I think I'd like a bun and a cup of cocoa, please," he announced. To his surprise, the helpful expression on the man's face disappeared as if by magic, and was replaced almost immediately by one he didn't like the look of at all. "A bun?" exclaimed the man. "And a cup of cocoa? I'll have you know this is a place of business, not a cafe. Just because I'm called a waiter, it doesn't mean to say I've got nothing better to do than serve young bears with cocoa of a morning." Paddington's face dropped as he listened to the man explain that Stock Exchange waiters were quite different to any other kind, and really had nothing at all to do with food and drink. "Anyway," concluded the man, "I'm afraid you can't come in, and that's that. The Stock Exchange is for members only. It's like a club, you know, and a very exclusive one at that," he added haughtily. "Perhaps I could join," said Paddington hopefully, as he felt in his duffel-coat pocket for 10p. "Join?" The waiter gave a hollow laugh. "You can't join just like that, you know. Why, bless me, there's all sorts of things you have to do first. You'd have to have your bona fides checked for a start." "Have my bona fides checked?" exclaimed Paddington, looking most upset. "I don't think I've got any." "Well, you certainly can't come in that case," said the waiter. "Bona fides," he continued in a very superior tone of voice, "bona fides is something you either has or you hasn't. They has to do with your forebears." "My forebears?" repeated Paddington, looking even more puzzled. "I've only got one bear. There's my Aunt Lucy in Peru. That's where I come from, darkest Peru. But I don't think I've got 4. The waiter began to breathe rather heavily. He'd had some difficult customers to deal with during the years he'd spent on the Stock Exchange, but this was one of the worst he could remember. "That's enough of that," he said sternly. "I think you'd best be cutting along now. I've got work to do, and it doesn't include chatting with young bears trying to get themselves free snacks of a morning." Looking most upset at the way things were turning out, Paddington began unlocking his suitcase. "I only wanted to change my stock," he exclaimed. "It's for the Portobello Oil Company, and I don't think it's any good."
"What's that?" exclaimed the man. "Did I hear you say you've got a share what's no good?"
He reached down and examined the piece of paper in Paddington's paw.
"Where did you get this, Bear?" he continued, as he guided Paddington across the floor in the direction of a door to one side of the hall.
"I bought it in the Portobello market," explained Paddington, pleased that he was getting somewhere at last. "Only I don't think it's a very good one because the man didn't turn up with my interest, so I thought I'd try and change it for another one instead."
"Just wait here, Bear," continued the man casually, as he ushered Paddington into a room full of deep leather armchairs. "I shan't keep you a moment."
As the door clicked shut behind the waiter, Paddington looked all around the room, picked on the deepest and most comfortable-looking armchair, and settled himself inside it with a pleased expression on his face. From past experience, he'd always found that if you went to the right people and kept on long enough, things had a habit of turning out right in the end. All the same, as the minutes ticked by and no one came to see him, Paddington began to look slightly more worried, and he was relieved when at long last footsteps approached from the outside and the door was flung open to reveal the waiter. To his surprise, 2 other men in raincoats and trilby hats were standing there as well.
"That's him,"
said the waiter, pointing at Paddington. The first of the 2 men entered the room and waved a card.
"Police," he said briefly. "I'm afraid we must take you along to the station."
"Take me to the station?" repeated Paddington, looking most surprised. "But I've only just got here."
The man gave him a nasty look. "Take you along to the police station," he repeated heavily, "where you will be remanded in custody while we make further inquiries."
Paddington jumped to his feet in alarm. "Remanded in custard?" he exclaimed. "I don't think Mrs. Bird will like that very much. It'll make my fur all matted."
The 2 men in plain clothes exchanged glances.
"Clever disguise," said the second one, ignoring Paddington's interruption. "I always pictured Jim the Dandy as being much taller, somehow." "Jim the Dandy?" echoed Paddington.
"Would have had me fooled," agreed the first man, turning an equally deaf ear. "And I've been through the rogues' gallery twice. Only shows you can't always go by people's descriptions." "Will there be a reward?" asked the waiter, hopefully. "Shouldn't be surprised," replied the first man. "We've been on the lookout for this character for some time. One of the cleverest confidence tricksters seen in London for many a year. Dutch shares, forgery, false passports. There's a list as long as your arm." "He'll be in prison for a good long stretch, you mark my words," agreed the second man.
Paddington looked from one to the other of the 3 men. "In prison?" he exclaimed in alarm. "But I only wanted to exchange my stock."
"Tell that to the judge," replied the first man. "Selling Dutch shares is a serious offence."
"But I didn't sell it," cried Paddington, waving his piece of paper wildly in the air. "I bought it. It cost me £10. All the notes had my special paw mark on them, and I wrote the numbers down on this share."
"What's that?"
The detective took the piece of paper from Paddington's paw and examined it with interest.
"You wrote all the numbers down?"
His voice broke off as Paddington suddenly shot past like a bullet out of a gun.
"Hey, stop!" he yelled.
"Come back!" cried the other man. But before either of them had time to move, Paddington had disappeared through the door. He cast some anxious glances over his shoulder, took a hurried look at the main door, where another waiter, attracted by the noise, stood barring his way, and then turned and headed towards the main body of the building. For the first time that morning, Paddington felt pleased that the stock exchange was such a crowded place of business. He still wasn't sure what all the fuss was about, but from where he'd been standing he hadn't liked the look of things at all. There were times when disappearing was much better than staying and trying to explain matters. And for someone who wanted to disappear in a hurry, the stock exchange would have been hard to beat. Mrs. Brown stood at the front door of number 32 Windsor Gardens and looked anxiously at the 2 men on her step. "Paddington?" she repeated. Did you say you wanted to see Paddington?"
"That's right, ma'am," replied one of the men.
He consulted a piece of paper in his hand.
"This share's got his name and address on it, and some kind of paw mark."
"I expect that's to show it's genuine," said Mrs. Brown doubtfully. "He usually does that, but it's rather early. Couldn't you come back later?"
"We're from Scotland Yard," broke in the second man, waving a card in the air. "We're rather anxious to see him about a certain matter that occurred yesterday."
"Scotland Yard?"
Mrs. Brown clutched at the door frame for support, but before she had time to go any deeper into the matter, Mrs. Bird came bustling up the hall.
"What on earth's going on?" she asked crossly. "I'm waiting to serve the breakfast. It's bad enough not being able to find Paddington with—" Her voice broke off as she caught sight of the look on Mrs. Brown's face. "There's nothing wrong, is there?" she asked.
"Bless you, no, ma'am," replied the second detective. "We only want to give him his notes back."
"Give him his notes back?" echoed Mrs. Brown.
£10, said the first detective. "Thanks to him putting the numbers down, we've recovered them all."
"And we've caught the criminal," said the second man.
"Wish there were more bears about like him," added the first one. "There'll be a reward, of course, but we'd like to congratulate him personally, if we may."
Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird exchanged glances. "You'd better come in," said Mrs. Brown, weakly. Neither of them had the slightest idea what the two detectives were talking about, but as Mrs. Bird led the way down the hall, she nodded to a door under the stairs. "You may find him in the coat cupboard," she said. "Thinking back, I heard some bangs going on in there soon after you rang the bell."
"Blimey," said one of the detectives as he bent down to open the door. "He's worse than the Scarlet Pimpernel."
"What?" exclaimed Paddington, looking most offended as he emerged from his hiding-place under the stairs. "What? I'm worse than a scarlet pimple?" Mrs. Bird paused at the kitchen door and gave a sigh. Judging from the look on Paddington's face, there were some complicated explanations to come. "I think I'll put some more bacon and eggs on," she said. "Trailing bears must be hungry work, and I have a feeling this may all take rather a long time." "Gosh," said Jonathan when things were back to normal. "Fancy Paddington having breakfast with two real detectives. Trust him. I can't wait to tell the chaps at school." Mr. Brown picked up his newspaper.
"And I can't wait to tell them at the office," he said, dabbing at his moustache with the serviette. "I'm about an hour late already."
"You can't go yet," said Judy as she entered the room. "You've all got to come and see your presents."
"Our presents?" exclaimed Mr. Brown as he followed Judy into the lounge. "Don't tell me we've got some more. We've had one lot already."
"These are special thank-you ones, Mr. Brown," explained Paddington as he watched the others unwrap their parcels. "I can pay for them now I've got my money back." "I got a lovely set of oil paints," said Judy. "And I got a super pair of skates," added Jonathan, echoing her thanks.
Mrs. Brown held up a large square of embroidered linen.
"What a lovely tablecloth," she exclaimed. "How very nice."
"A pipe," said Mr. Brown, opening a small cardboard box. "Just what I wanted. Couldn't have chosen better myself." Mrs. Bird's eyes looked suspiciously moist as she held up a pink bed jacket for the others to see.
"It's my favourite colour," she said. "How very kind of you to get things we all need, Paddington. You must have given it a lot of thought."
"I don't suppose you'll have much money left over after you've paid for all this," said Mr. Brown, when all the excitement had died down. "But if you'd care to let me have it, I might be able to get hold of one or two real shares for you." Paddington thought for a moment. It wasn't that he didn't trust Mr. Brown, but all in all he felt he had quite enough of stocks and shares for a while.
"I think perhaps I really will put the rest of it in the bank this time." Mrs. Brown turned away from the hall mirror and made a face as the sound of hammering rent the morning air. "I suppose I mustn't grumble," she said. "Henry's been making enough noise himself these past few weeks, but I do wish Mr. Curry would hurry up and finish all his jobs. He does go on rather." Mrs. Bird gave one of her Mr. Curry snorts as she put some finishing touches to her bonnet. The Browns' neighbour, apart from having a reputation in the district for his meanness, also had a habit of copying other people, and living next door to him, the Browns suffered more than most. During Paddington's absence in Peru, Mr. Brown had carried out quite a number of jobs in and around their house. Apart from decorating several of the rooms, he'd also laid a concrete path in the back garden and installed a serving hatch between their kitchen and the dining room. Mr. Curry had been hard put to it to keep up with all the activity in number 32 Windsor Gardens, but only the day before he'd announced in a loud voice his intention of carrying out the last two tasks himself in the near future, and that very morning he'd arrived in his back garden dressed in an old boiler suit in order to make preparations for the path. "I must say," began Mrs. Brown, "I must say there are times when I find taking the family all the way across London just to visit the dentist a bit of a nuisance, but I shan't be at all sorry today." She gave a sigh as another burst of hammering echoed between the two buildings. "Are you sure you don't want to come with us, Paddington?" she called. Paddington hurried into the hall at the sound of his name. "No, thank you, Mrs. Brown," he exclaimed when she repeated her question. Although he'd never actually been to a dentist, he didn't like the sound of them at all, especially after listening to some of Jonathan's graphic descriptions of what went on. "I think perhaps I'll stay at home and sit in the garden instead," he announced before anyone could try and change his mind for him. Mrs. Brown eyed the retreating figure of Paddington as he disappeared into the dining room. "You know, it's an extraordinary thing," she remarked, "but I do believe he's turned over a new leaf. Do you realize we haven't had a single disaster since he came back from Peru? Not one." Mrs. Bird hastily touched wood as she made for the front door. "Don't tempt fate," she warned. "That young bear doesn't need any encouragement." But even the Browns' housekeeper would have been hard put to find fault with Paddington's behaviour, at least for the next few minutes or so, had she been there to see it. Having finished breakfast, he carefully wiped his whiskers on the serviette provided by a hopeful Mrs. Brown, and then made his way through the French windows and out onto the terrace, where he stood for a moment, sniffing the morning air. But the peace of Paddington's morning was short-lived, for just as he was making some last-minute adjustments to a deck chair so that he could sit down for a while and enjoy the morning sunshine, a familiar voice rang out over the fence. "Good morning, Bear," said the voice. Paddington jumped up. "Good morning, Mr. Curry," he said, raising his hat politely. The Browns' neighbour waved a large mallet in Paddington's direction. "I wonder if you'd care to lend a paw, Bear," he said casually. "I'm putting in some stakes, and it's a bit difficult with only one pair of hands." Mr. Curry's voice droned on about his various jobs as he helped Paddington through a hole in the fence. "Now, I've marked the positions where I want them all," he continued as Paddington stood up. "There are 150 altogether. I'll just show you what I want done, and then you can carry on for a while I go out and do my shopping. I want to get some paint for my new serving hatch when it's in." Mr. Curry paused for breath. "I don't suppose you'll get all the stakes in before I'm back, but if you do, you can collect some rubble for me. It's for the foundations, and I'm running a bit short. In fact, I might even give you 10p if you do. Mind you," he added, before Paddington had time to speak, "I shan't if it's not proper brick rubble. I don't want to come back home and find half my rockery missing. Now come along, Bear," he growled sternly as he handed Paddington the mallet. "Don't just stand there. I've got a lot of shopping to do, and I want to get out this morning." Mr. Curry picked up a stake from a nearby pile and then pushed it firmly into the ground with both hands. "Now," he said, "when I nod my head, you hit it." Well, for a moment, Paddington looked at Mr. Curry as if he could hardly believe his ears. And then, as the Brown's neighbour closed his eyes and began nodding his head vigorously to show that he was ready, Paddington took a firm grip of the mallet with both paws. A moment later, a yell of pain rang out round Windsor Gardens, echoing and re-echoing in and out of the buildings. Paddington jumped back in alarm, and the mallet fell unheeded from his paws as, to his surprise, instead of looking pleased, Mr. Curry let go of the stake, gave another tremendous yell, and then began dancing up and down, clutching his head with both hands. "Bear!" he roared as Paddington disappeared through the hole in the fence. "Bear! Where are you, Bear? Come back, Bear!" But Paddington was nowhere to be seen. Only the faintest movement of the raspberry canes betrayed his whereabouts, and a few moments later even that stopped as Mr. Curry peered over the fence before staggering back up the garden towards his house. For the next few minutes the distant sound of banging doors and the hiss of running water greeted Paddington's ears. But at long last, a final and much louder bang from the front of Mr. Curry's house caused him to heave a sigh of relief as he stood up and brushed himself clean. Paddington hesitated for a moment, and then climbed back through the hole in the fence and stared gloomily at the beginnings of Mr. Curry's path. The Brown's neighbour had a habit of twisting words so that his listeners were never quite certain what had actually been said, but he was almost sure that he hadn't agreed to lend a paw with one of the stakes, let alone do all 150 by himself. Now that he had time to examine it more carefully, the pile of stakes looked even bigger than it had at first sight. Not only that, but to add to his troubles, Mr. Curry appeared to have taken the mallet away with him. After making several attempts to knock in some stakes with the aid of half a brick, Paddington gave up in disgust and hurried up the path in the direction of Mr. Curry's house. In his haste, the Brown's neighbour had left his back door ajar, and a few moments later Paddington let himself cautiously into the kitchen. It was some while since he'd last set foot in Mr. Curry's kitchen, and from the little he could remember of it, the decorations then had been mostly of a rather dirty brown colour, certainly nothing like the ones which greeted him now. In fact, all in all, apart from a bag of tools in one corner and one or two obviously unfinished patches, it now looked like something out of one of Mrs. Brown's glossy magazines, or even, for that matter, Mrs. Brown's own freshly decorated kitchen itself. The walls were gleaming white, the floor black and equally shiny, and even the stove and refrigerator looked new. It was as he stood taking it all in that a thoughtful expression gradually came over Paddington's face. Leaning against one of the walls was a wooden frame and a pair of doors, and seeing it reminded him of a remark passed by Mr. Curry as he'd helped him through the fence. He'd said, "I'm on the last lap in my kitchen, Bear. There's only the serving hatch to put in, and the job will be done." Mr. Curry had gone on to grumble about the number of unfinished jobs he had on hand, but at the time Paddington was too busy worrying about the stakes to take much notice. However, the more he thought about the matter now, the more it seemed like a golden opportunity to make amends for the unfortunate accident earlier in the day. A few minutes later, the sound of hammering could be heard in Windsor Gardens. It was followed shortly afterwards by the dull thud of a falling brick, the first of many which gradually found their way from inside the kitchen to a large pile outside the back door. Paddington felt sure from the little Mr. Curry had said about all his jobs that he couldn't fail to be pleased if he arrived home later that morning and found his serving hatch already installed. And even if the hatch itself wasn't in place, he couldn't possibly find anything to grumble at in having made a start on the whole. Apart from that, knocking down walls was much more enjoyable work than banging in stakes. Once a start had been made by removing the first brick, which had taken rather a lot of hammering with a cold chisel, It was more a matter of clouting everything in sight as hard as possible and standing back every now and then to avoid being hit by some of the larger lumps as they parted company from the rest. Soon the air was so thick with dust it became almost impossible to see. But as the last brick fell to the floor, Paddington surveyed the result of his labours as best he could through half-closed eyes, and then measured the space carefully with his paws in order to make sure it was the right size. After placing the frame carefully into position and making it secure by jamming in a couple of pieces of wood either side, he slipped the doors into their grooves and then stood back, waiting for the dust to settle so that he could inspect his handiwork. As the air gradually cleared, Paddington began to look more and more pleased with himself. Admittedly, the hatch wasn't perfectly level, and there were one or two rather unfortunate paw marks on the surrounding wall, but those two things apart, he decided it was one of the best jobs he could ever remember doing, and he felt sure Mr. Curry would be equally pleased when he saw it. Dipping his paw into a nearby jar of marmalade, he idly pushed one of the doors to one side, in order to make sure that it slid properly on its runners. As he did so, the pleased expression suddenly drained from Paddington's face, and he nearly toppled over backwards with surprise as he took in the view through the open hatch. Since he'd lived with the Browns, he'd examined number 32 Windsor Gardens from a good many different angles, but never, in his wildest dreams, had he ever pictured seeing it through a serving hatch in Mr. Curry's kitchen wall, particularly when he expected to see a dining room instead. Well, for a moment, Paddington stood where he was, with his feet frozen to the ground, and then he hurried outside, rubbing his eyes in order to make sure it wasn't all part of some terrible dream. As he peered up at the outside wall, Paddington's worst fears were realized, and gradually the truth of the matter dawned on him. In his hurry to complete the job, he'd quite forgotten the fact that although Mr. Curry's house was exactly the same in most respects as the Browns', because it was next door, everything was the other way round, so that what was the dining-room wall in the Browns' house actually became the outside wall in Mr. Curry's. Paddington's face grew longer and longer as he considered the matter. There were still several pieces of brick lying on the ground where they'd fallen, but after one or two attempts he soon gave up all hope of fitting them back into position. How long he stayed lost in thought, Paddington wasn't quite sure, but he was suddenly roused from his daydreams by the sound of Mr. Curry's side gate banging shut. Hurrying round to the back of the house, he was just in time to meet the Browns' neighbour coming round the other way. Apart from some sticking plaster on the back of his head, Mr. Curry looked little the worse for his earlier encounter with Paddington. Nevertheless, his face darkened as they bumped into each other. "What are you up to now, Bear?" he growled. "What am I up to, Mr. Curry?" said Paddington, playing for time. Mr. Curry looked suspiciously at the brick dust sticking to Paddington's fur, and then, as he caught sight of the pile of brick rubble outside the kitchen door, his face suddenly cleared. "Good work, Bear," he said approvingly as he felt in his pocket. "I promised you 10p, and I must say you've earned it." "Thank you very much, Mr. Curry," said Paddington as he took the coin. "I'll keep it for a while in case you want it back." "What? Nonsense! Of course I shan't want it back. This rubble's just what I need for my path." "I don't think I should use it for your path, Mr. Curry," said Paddington anxiously. "You may want it for something else." Mr. Curry gave a loud snort as he picked up his shovel. "Not use it?" he repeated. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't, Bear." Paddington looked on unhappily as Mr. Curry transferred the pile of rubble into a nearby trench, and when, some while later, the Browns' neighbour poured a barrow-load of wet concrete over the top, he looked unhappier still. "There," said Mr. Curry, rubbing his hands together. "That won't come up again in a hurry once it's set." He turned, but for the second time that morning he found himself addressing the empty air, for his audience, like the brick rubble, had completely disappeared from view. Paddington sat up in bed, holding a thermometer in his paw. "I think I must have caught the measles, Mrs. Bird," he announced weakly. "My temperature's over 120. 120? Mrs. Bird hurriedly examined the thermometer. "That's not a temperature," she exclaimed with relief. "That's a marmalade stain." Mrs. Brown looked Paddington over carefully. "He's certainly got some red spots on him," she said. "It's a bit difficult to tell with fur, but I suppose it could be measles." Said Mrs. Bird suspiciously. "That's as maybe. But it's the first time I've ever known measles spots come off on the sheets." "Perhaps they've worked loose, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington hopefully. "I've been scratching them." Mrs. Brown exchanged a glance with her housekeeper. "It looks more like brick dust to me," she said. Mrs. Bird glanced out of the window towards the house next door. "Talking of brick dust," she said, "it reminds me that Mr. Curry called to see you just now, Paddington." A loud groan came from the direction of Paddington's bed. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "Is anything the matter?" "I think I've had a bit of a relapse, Mrs. Brown," said a weak voice from under the sheet. "I don't think I ought to do any more talking." "That's a pity," said Mrs. Bird. "He asked me to give you 10p. 10p? Exclaimed Paddington, sitting up in bed suddenly. "But I've already had one." "In that case," said Mrs. Bird, "you've got 20. "Apparently he's very pleased with his new delivery hatch," explained Mrs. Brown. "All sorts of people have been congratulating him. The milkman, the baker, the boy from the grocery shop. They all think it's a splendid idea. Mr. Curry's going to build a cupboard inside so that they can leave things and he won't have to answer the door. Mind you," she continued, "I can't help feeling it's a good job Judy managed to catch the milkman when she did." "And that Jonathan had a chat with the baker," added Mrs. Bird. "Otherwise," said Mrs. Brown, "I might not have thought to have had a word with the grocery boy." "And where," said the housekeeper, "would we have been then?" Mrs. Bird looked towards Paddington's bed, but the only answer she received was a loud groan, as its occupant appeared to have another sudden relapse. All the same, although as groans went it was a long and rather blood-curdling one, there was something about the set of Paddington's whiskers as they poked out from beneath the sheets which somehow managed to suggest the possibility of a recovery in the not-too-distant future. "I give it till tea-time at the outside," said Mrs. Brown as she closed the door. "If not before," agreed Mrs. Bird. "I'm baking a treacle tart for tea." "In that case," said Mrs. Brown, "definitely before. There's nothing like a few whiffs of treacle tart up the stairs for curing even the worst attack of a young bear's measles." Mrs. Brown looked out of the car window. "If you want my opinion," she said, lowering her voice so that the occupants of the back seat, and one occupant in particular, shouldn't hear, "if you want my opinion, bringing Paddington with us is asking for trouble. You know what happened when he went to Jonathan's school?" "Well, that wasn't exactly a disaster," said Mr. Brown mildly. "If I remember rightly, he saved the day. If it hadn't been for him, the old boys would never have won their cricket match." "Playing in a cricket match isn't the same as watching ballet," replied Mrs. Brown. "He'll never sit quietly through a whole afternoon of it. Something's bound to happen." She gave a sigh. Ever since Paddington had taken part in an epic cricket match at Jonathan's school, Judy had been clamouring for him to visit her school in turn, and Mrs. Brown knew that she was fighting a losing battle. Having a bear in the family gave both Jonathan and Judy a certain amount of prestige amongst their fellow pupils, and Judy was anxious to catch up on the lead at present held by her brother. All the same, as they drew nearer and nearer to Judy's school, Mrs. Brown began to look more and more worried. "Good heavens!" exclaimed Mr. Brown suddenly as they turned the corner and passed through the wrought-iron gates. He waved his hand towards a seething mass of girls in uniform as he brought the car to a halt. "What's this? Some sort of reception committee?" "What did I tell you?" said Mrs. Brown, as the familiar figure of Judy detached itself from the crowd and came forward to greet them. "It's started already." Paddington, as he clambered out of the back seat, looked even more surprised as he stood blinking in the strong sunlight, listening to the cheers, and he raised his hat several times in response to the cries. "Come along, Paddington," said Judy, grabbing his paw. "You've lots of people to meet, and we've got to pay a visit to the tuck shop. I told Mrs. Beadle, the lady in charge, all about you, and she's laid on some special marmalade sandwiches." "Mrs. Beadle's laid on some marmalade sandwiches?" exclaimed Paddington, looking most impressed. Although he was very keen on anything to do with marmalade, and had several times sat on a sandwich by mistake, he'd never met anyone who'd actually done it on purpose before, particularly somebody in charge of a tuck shop. However, before he had time to inquire into the matter, the throng of girls closed in behind him, and he felt himself being propelled gently but firmly in the direction of a small building which stood to one side of the quadrangle in front of the main block. As the milling crowd of figures disappeared through the door of the tuck shop, Mrs. Brown looked towards a large, brightly coloured poster on a board near the main gate. "I thought this Russian dancer they're having down, Sergei Oblomov, was supposed to be the guest of honour," she remarked. "I don't think he'll like it if he turns up and there's no one here. I'm sure all these girls were meant for him, not Paddington." "Talk of the devil," said Mr. Brown, as a large, important-looking black car swept in through the gates and came to a halt a few yards away. "I have a feeling this is him." Pretending to study the scenery, the Browns nevertheless watched with interest as the door of the car opened and a tall figure dressed in a black cloak alighted and stood for a moment with one hand in the air, looking expectantly all around. "Crikey!" said Jonathan a few moments later, as the sound of a door being slammed echoed round the quadrangle, and the car swept past them in a cloud of dust towards the school building. "He didn't look in a very good mood." "I don't suppose you'd like it," said Mrs. Brown, "if you were a famous dancer and you had your thunder stolen by a bear, especially one stuffing himself with marmalade sandwiches in the school tuck shop." "He doesn't know it's a bear," reasoned Mr. Brown. "He's never even met Paddington." "No," said Mrs. Brown decidedly, as they made their way towards the school building. "No, he hasn't, and if I have my way, he's not going to either." She cast some anxious glances in the direction of the tuck shop as they passed by. Several times the ominous sound of cheering had come from the open windows, and one or two of them had been decidedly loud, rather as if things were getting out of control. All the same, as they seated themselves in the school hall some while later, even Mrs. Brown found it hard to fault Paddington's appearance. Admittedly, there were still one or two traces of marmalade on his whiskers, and his fur had lost some of its smooth sheen, but all in all, he looked unusually well behaved as he settled himself at the end of the row by the gangway and examined his programme with interest. "You know, I'm really looking forward to this," said Mrs. Bird with enthusiasm, as she made herself comfortable. "I like ballet dancing." The others looked at their housekeeper in surprise as a far-away look came into her eyes. "I haven't seen any good dancing for, I don't know how many years." "I'm not sure you're going to now," whispered Mr. Brown, as the curtain rose to reveal a woodland glade and several small figures dressed as toadstools. "It's the juniors," whispered Judy. "They're doing their nature dance." Paddington opened his suitcase, took out his opera glasses, and peered at the stage with interest. "Are you enjoying it?" whispered Judy. Paddington thought for a moment. "It's all right," he said, "but I can't hear what they're saying." "People don't say anything in ballet," hissed Judy. "They mime it all. You have to guess what they're doing by the dancing." Paddington sank back into his seat. Although he didn't want to hurt Judy's feelings by saying so, he didn't think much of ballet at all. As far as he could see, it was just a lot of people running after each other on the stage. And apart from not saying anything, which made it all rather difficult to follow, he began to wonder why they didn't get taller dancers in the first place, as some of the older girls in particular seemed to spend most of the time standing on their toes. However, he was a polite bear, and he applauded dutifully at the end of each item. "I must say, that swan took a long time to die," said Mr. Brown, as the lights went up at long last to herald the interval. "I thought she was never going to get it over with." Judy handed Paddington her programme. "It's the famous Russian dancer next," she said. "Look, there's his picture." Paddington peered at the programme with interest. "Serge Oblomov," he exclaimed in surprise. "It's not Serge," said Judy. "It's Sir Guy." "Sir Guy Oblomov?" repeated Paddington, looking most impressed as he studied the picture. "I don't think I've ever seen a lord doing a ballet dance before." "He isn't a lord. He's a—" Judy gave a sigh as she sought for the right words. Sometimes explaining things to Paddington became complicated out of all proportion. "Well, whatever he is," said Mrs. Bird, coming to her rescue, "I'm really looking forward to it. It's a great treat." "Oh, crikey!" exclaimed Judy suddenly, as a girl from the row behind whispered something in her ear. "I'm not sure if he's going to appear after all. They're having some trouble backstage." "What?" exclaimed Paddington hotly. "Sir Guy Oblomov's not going to appear?" "It's something to do with no one being at the gates to meet him," explained the girl in the seat behind. "He's a bit temperamental, and it upset him rather." Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. "I told you so, Henry," said Mrs. Brown. "I said if we brought Paddington something would happen." "Well, you can't really blame poor old Paddington for this," replied Mr. Brown. "It's not his fault if everyone wanted to meet him instead of some blessed ballet dancer chap. After all—" Mr. Brown suddenly broke off in mid-sentence. "That's funny," he said, as he looked along the aisle. "Talking of Paddington, where's he got to?" "He was here a second ago," said Judy, looking all around. "Look!" cried Jonathan, pointing down the aisle. "There he is!" The Browns followed the direction of Jonathan's arm and were just in time to see a small figure disappear through a door at the side of the stage. From where they were sitting, it wasn't possible to see the expression on Paddington's face, but there was a determined slant to his hat and a look about his duffel coat which seemed to bode ill for anyone who got in his way. "Don't you think you'd better go after him, Judy?" said Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Too late," groaned Judy. "Did you see who was behind the door?" "Miss Grimshaw." Judy sank lower and lower into her seat as she contemplated the awful prospect of Paddington coming face to face with her headmistress, although had she but known, Miss Grimshaw, weighed down by all the worries backstage, seemed almost glad to find someone from outside the school she could talk to. Are you Russian?" she asked hopefully, after Paddington had introduced himself. "Well, I am in a bit of a hurry," admitted Paddington, raising his hat politely. "I've come to see Sir Guy." Miss Grimshaw looked at him suspiciously. "I said Russian," she explained, "not rushing. And I'm not at all sure Mr. Oblomov will see you. I was hoping you might be Russian so that you could talk to him in his own language and make him feel more at home, but if you're not, I'd rather you didn't." "Mrs. Bird's very upset," replied Paddington. "I'm sure she is," said Miss Grimshaw. "I'm upset. We're all upset. Mr. Oblomov's upset. Deirdre Shaw's upset." "Deirdre Shaw?" echoed Paddington, looking most surprised. "She was supposed to partner Mr. Oblomov in the pas de deux," explained Miss Grimshaw. "Then, when Mr. Oblomov said he wouldn't dance, she ran off to her dormitory in tears, and no one's seen her since." While Miss Grimshaw was speaking, a nearby door opened, and a tall, imposing figure in black tights emerged. "I have changed my mind," announced Mr. Oblomov, waving his hand imperiously as he did a series of knee-bending exercises. "I will not disappoint my public. First, I will dance my famous solo from the Swan Lake. Then I will perform the pas de deux. I trust everything is ready, no?" "No," exclaimed Miss Grimshaw. "I mean, that is to say, Yes, I'm sure it will be." Miss Grimshaw's usual icy calm seemed to have deserted her for once as Sir Guy Oblomoff strode past, heading for the stage. Oh dear," she exclaimed. "Now he's changed his mind again, and Deirdre Shaw's disappeared. What's he going to say when he finds he's without a partner in the second half? I shudder to think." As the school orchestra started up and the curtain rose to a tremendous round of applause, Miss Grimshaw rushed off, wringing her hands, leaving Paddington staring with a very thoughtful expression on his face indeed, in the direction of the open door leading to Sir Guy Oblomoff's dressing room. Even Mr. Brown sat up in his seat and clapped as loudly as anyone as Sir Guy Oblomoff executed one perfect pirouette after another, spinning round and round so fast it left the audience breathless. And when he followed this with a series of breathtaking arabesques, everyone gasped with admiration, and the rafters of the hall fairly shook with the ovation which greeted the end of this item. As the applause died away, and Sir Guy Oblomoff stood for a moment motionless in the beam from a single spotlight, Mrs. Bird gave a quick glance at her programme. "It's the pas de deux now," she whispered. "Golly, I hope they've found Deirdre Shaw," said Judy in a low voice as the music started up. "There's going to be an awful row if they haven't." "It's all right," said Mr. Brown. "I think I can see someone lurking at the side of the stage." Judy followed the direction of Mr. Brown's gaze, and then jumped up from her seat in alarm. "Crikey!" she exclaimed. "That's not Deirdre Shaw, that's Paddington!" exclaimed the rest of the family, joining her in a chorus as the shadowy figure moved onto the stage and into the light. "Mercy me!" cried Mrs. Bird. "What on earth is that bear up to now?" Her words were lost in the gasp of astonishment which went up all around them as Paddington advanced towards the centre of the stage, placed his suitcase carefully in front of the footlights, and then raised his hat politely to the several members of the audience in the front row who began half-heartedly to applaud. "Oh dear, I wish he wouldn't wear that old hat," said Mrs. Brown. "And what on earth's he got on his legs?" asked Mrs. Bird. "Looks like some kind of sacking to me," said Mr. Brown. "They're not sacks," said Judy. "They're tights." "They don't look very tight to me," said Mr. Brown. "They look as if they're going to come down any moment." The Browns watched in horror as Paddington, having ventured one bow too many, hurriedly replaced his hat and grabbed hold of the roll of material which hung around his waist in large folds. Now, for the first time since he'd decided to lend a paw with the ballet, he was beginning to wish he'd resisted the temptation to use the pair of tights which he'd found hanging on the back of Mr. Oblomoff's dressing-room door. Bear's legs being rather short put him at a disadvantage to start with, but as far as he could make out, Sir Guy Oblomoff's legs were twice as long as anyone else's, so that an unusually large amount of surplus material had to be lost at the top. Apart from tying a piece of string round his waist, Paddington had hopefully made use of several drawing pins which he'd found on a notice board at the back of the stage, but most of these seemed to have fallen out, so he had to spend some moments making last-minute adjustments to a large safety pin which he'd put on in case of an emergency. It was at this moment that Sir Guy Oblomoff, oblivious to all that had been going on, finished executing a particularly long and difficult pirouette near a pillar at the back of the stage, and then came hurrying down towards him. He stood for a moment, poised on one foot, his eyes closed as he prepared himself for the big moment. Paddington raised his hat politely once again, and then took hold of one of Mr. Oblomoff's outstretched hands and shook it warmly with his paw. "Good afternoon, Sir Guy," he exclaimed. "I've come to do the pas de deux." Sir Guy Oblomoff seemed suddenly to freeze in his position. For a brief moment, in fact, he seemed almost to have turned into stone. But then several things happened to him in quick succession. First, he opened his eyes, then he closed them, and a shiver passed through his body, starting at his toes and travelling up to his head, almost as if he'd been shot. Then he opened his eyes again and stared distastefully at his hand. It was warm under the lights, and some kind of sticky substance seemed to have transferred itself from Paddington's paw. "It's all right, Sir Guy," explained Paddington, wiping his paw hastily on one of the folds in his tights. "It's only marmalade. I forgot to wash it off when I came out of the tuck shop." Well, if Mr. Oblomov knew what marmalade was, or, for that matter, if he'd ever heard of a tuck shop, he gave no sign. A shiver again seemed to pass through his body, and as the music reached a crescendo, he closed his eyes and with a supreme effort prepared himself once more for the pas de deux. Feeling very pleased that things seemed to have turned out all right in the end, Paddington took hold of Sir Guy Oblomov's outstretched hand and bent down to pick up the suitcase. The next moment it felt as if he was in the centre of an earthquake, a tornado, and a barrage of thunderbolts all rolled into one. First, it seemed as if his arm had been torn out of its socket. Then he felt himself spinning round and round like a top. Finally, he landed, still spinning, in a heap on the floor of the stage some distance away from Mr. Oblomov. For a moment he lay where he was, gasping for breath, and then he struggled to his feet just in time to see a vague figure in tights heading towards him through the glare of the footlights. As he focused on the scene, Paddington noticed a nasty-looking gleam in Sir Guy Oblomov's eyes, which he didn't like the look of at all, and so he hurriedly sat down again. Mr. Oblomov came to a halt and stared down at the figure on the floor. "I cannot go on," he exclaimed gloomily. "For one thing, you have too much shortness, and for the second thing, your entrechats, they are not clean." "My entrechats are not clean," exclaimed Paddington hotly. "But I had a bath last night." "I do not mean they are dirty," hissed Mr. Oblomov. "I mean they should be clean, snappy, like so." And without further ado, he threw himself into the air, beat his legs together, crossed them in time to the music, and then uncrossed them again as he landed gracefully on one foot facing the audience. Paddington looked rather doubtful as the applause rang through the hall. "It's a bit difficult when you've only got paws, Sir Guy," he exclaimed. "But I'll have a try." Closing his eyes, as he'd seen Mr. Oblomov do, Paddington jumped into the air, made a half-hearted attempt to cross his legs, and then, as his tights began to slip, landed rather heavily on the stage. As he did so, to everyone's surprise, he suddenly shot up into the air again, his legs crossing and uncrossing, almost as if he'd been fired from a cannon. "Good gracious!" exclaimed somebody near the Browns. "That young bear's done a triple." "It's a sixer," contradicted another elderly gentleman knowledgeably, as Paddington landed and then shot up in the air again with a loud cry. "Bravo!" he called, trying to make himself heard above the applause. Even Sir Guy Oblomov began to look impressed as Paddington executed several more entrechats, each one higher and more complicated than the one before. And then, to show he wasn't beaten, he himself gave a tremendous leap into the air, changed his legs over, beat them together, changed them back again, beat them together once more, and then, to a roar from the audience, crossed them once again before landing. Paddington, who'd been spending the last few seconds sitting on the stage, peering at one of his paws, jumped up with a loud cry which echoed round the rafters as Sir Guy Oblomov landed heavily on his other paw. If the applause for Sir Guy Oblomov's entrechat had been loud, it was nothing compared to that which greeted Paddington as he shot up into the air once more, waving his paws wildly to and fro, crossing and uncrossing them and bringing them together before he landed, and then catapulted up again, almost out of sight. Well, this time Sir Guy Oblomov himself had to acknowledge he'd met his match, and with a graceful bow which brought murmurs of approval from the audience, he stood back and joined in the applause as the music finally came to an end, and with Paddington's leaps growing higher and wilder with every passing second, the curtain came down. "Well," said Mr. Brown as the applause finally subsided, "it may not have been the best ballet I've ever seen, but it was certainly the most exciting.
I haven't seen anything like it since the Cossacks, agreed the elderly gentleman nearby. 5 grand royals in a row.
Thoroughly surprised by the events of the afternoon, the Browns tried to make their way backstage, but what with the speeches and the crowds of girls who came up to Judy in order to congratulate her on Paddington's performance, it was some while before they were able to force their way through the door at the side of the stage. When they did finally break through, they were even more surprised to find that Paddington had been removed to the school sanatorium for what was called urgent first aid. "Oh, dear, I hope he hasn't broken anything," said Mrs. Brown anxiously as they hurried across the quadrangle. "Some of those jumps he did were very high." "More likely to have slipped on a marmalade chunk," said Mrs. Bird as they hurried into the ward. But even Mrs. Bird looked worried when she caught sight of Paddington, lying on a bed with his 2 back paws sticking up in the air, swathed in bandages. "I can't understand it," said Miss Grimshaw. She came forward to greet them. "Both his back paws are full of holes. I really must find Matron and see what she's got to say." "Holes?" echoed the Browns.
"Holes," said Miss Grimshaw. "Quite small ones, almost as if he'd got woodworm. Not that he could have, of course," she added hastily, as a groan came from the direction of the bed. "Such a shame after the magnificent performance he gave. I doubt if we shall ever see the like again."
As Miss Grimshaw hurried off in search of the matron, Mrs. Bird gave a snort. Something about Paddington's leaps on the stage had aroused her suspicions, and now her eagle eyes had spotted a number of small, shiny objects under the bed that so far no one else had seen.
"Bears who try to pin their tights up with drawing pins," she said sternly, "mustn't be surprised when they fall out. And they mustn't be disappointed if they step on them into the bargain and have to stay in hospital and miss the special marmalade pudding that's waiting for them at home."
Paddington sat up in bed.
"I think perhaps they're getting better now," he said hastily.
Being an invalid with everyone fussing around was rather nice. On the other hand, marmalade pudding, particularly Mrs. Bird's marmalade pudding, was even nicer.
"But it's no good if you want to carry on dancing," warned Mrs. Bird,
as he clambered out of bed and tested his paws on the floor.
"It's much too rich and heavy. In fact, I'm not sure that you oughtn't to go on a diet."
But Mrs. Bird's words fell on empty air as Paddington disappeared through the door in the direction of the car with remarkable haste for one who'd only just risen from a sick-bed. "Perhaps it's as well," said Mr. Brown gravely as the others followed. "I can't really picture Paddington embarking on a career as a ballet dancer."
"All those exercises," agreed Mrs. Brown with a shudder. "And those tights," said Judy. "And all that leaping about," added Mrs. Bird. "If you ask me, it's much better to be simply a bear who likes his marmalade." "Especially," said Jonathan, amid general agreement, "especially if you happen to be a bear called Paddington."